Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk. On Monday's podcast, we were talking about shifting political landscapes, and I quipped that perhaps by the midterms, we'd be at war with Venezuela. If you keep up with the news coming out of the Caribbean, it seems like it could be a lot sooner than that. And if you're more of a betting markets person, according to the folks at Polymarket, there's a 56% chance Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro will be out of power by the end of next year. Things appear to be escalating quickly. The U.S. has launched 25 strikes in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific since early September, killing 95 people per tracking at the New York Times. The stated goal of the strikes has been to stop drug traffickers that the Trump administration has labeled terrorist organizations. But there are questions about the legality of the strikes and questions about whether the goal is really to put pressure on Maduro with the hopes of ousting him. Speaking of pressure, last week the U.S. seized an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela, and this week President Trump announced a complete blockade on sanctioned oil tankers going to and from Venezuela. This comes closer to threatening the lifeblood of the Venezuelan economy. Venezuela holds the world's largest proven oil reserves, and oil makes up 90 to 95% of its export revenue. The U.S. has also deployed military assets to the region capable of land strikes and disabling Venezuela's, and Trump has said that he's authorized covert CIA operations in the country. I'll admit myself to being a little behind the curve on this story, so in an effort to get us up to speed, I've invited on Michael O'Hanlon. He's the Phil Knight Chair in Defense and Strategy at the Brookings Institution and the author of the forthcoming book, To Dare Mighty Things, U.S. Defense Strategy Since the Revolution. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Galen. And let me say, if you're behind the curve, then the rest of us need to do some better homework ourselves, because that was a pretty concise and effective introduction. So I look forward to discussing with you today.
Well, I very much appreciate that. And I should also say that we are speaking on Wednesday, right after the Senate passed a $900 billion defense budget. And if we have time, I want to ask you about that and the recent series from the New York Times editorial board arguing that the U.S. military is antiquated, slow, too often used as a local jobs program, and not prepared for the threats of today, most particularly from China. However, first things first, let's start with the basics. Is the United States about to go to war with Venezuela?
Well, I think that there's a good chance we will use some kind of military force above and beyond what's already happened. Some people would say the very declaration of a blockade, therefore, answers affirmatively your question, that we are already at war, since a blockade historically and legally is considered a form of war and an instrument of war. And so maybe we're already there. And maybe the question really is going to be what comes next. That is the question. I can imagine a number of things. I think an all-out invasion remains a possibility, but an unlikely one. President Trump came to power really within the Republican Party before he even got elected nationally in 2016 by challenging the legacy of George W. Bush and of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. This was sort of the beginning of the revolution within the Republican Party that he's affected over the last decade. And he began by going straight to the issue that Bush had, based much of his presidency upon and his reelection campaign upon. And Trump said, no, with all due respect, President Bush, you were wrong to want to invade these countries and essentially, have the Pottery Barn rule. If you break it, you own it. So I don't know that Trump's going to want to put force on the ground in Venezuela. One more argument in support of that conclusion would be the recent national security strategy put out just last week by the Trump administration, in which they articulated this Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And that's a very telling combination of terms because, of course, the Monroe Doctrine, as we all learned in school, was the 1823 edict more than 2 centuries ago by President Monroe, telling European powers to keep their mitts off the entire Western Hemisphere. And this was a time when we barely had a Navy, and we were already advancing this audacious claim. That's the kind of thing I discuss in my new book, The History of U.S. Defense Strategy and the assertiveness that we've displayed really from the get-go. And then, of course, Theodore Roosevelt, when he was president, 80 years later, issued the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine that said basically the United States has a special interest in anything happening in the Mexico, Central America, Caribbean region, and we will reserve or arrogate to ourselves the right to determine events and to change politics within that sector of the Western Hemisphere in particular if we don't like what's going on. And we actually implemented that policy a lot. We went back into Mexico with the military under Woodrow Wilson. We went into Nicaragua, El Salvador, Dominican Republic, a lot of small, limited operations, mostly maritime. And sorry for the long answer, but that's why I think Trump used this concept of a Trump corollary. He does like Theodore Roosevelt. He also likes McKinley, the predecessor to Roosevelt, and he knows enough of his history to know what these guys did with that kind of military power. And they did not do big invasions, although, of course, McKinley did wind up owning the Philippines for a while after the Spanish-American War. But that was something that didn't go very well, and we decided we didn't like it very well. What was much more telling, and for Trump more indicative of where he'd want to go, was the taking of Cuba, the taking of Puerto Rico, the taking of Guam, the consolidation of control over Hawaii. These were all under McKinley. And then Roosevelt using limited power here in the hemisphere close to shore to do things that required local governments to either change their composition or change their behavior without putting major numbers of U.S. troops on the ground. I think that's what Trump wants to do. And if one last point, and I'll promise all my answers will be a lot shorter from here, but if you look at more modern analogies that I think Trump is obsessed with or transfixed by. Bear in mind, in his first term, he completed the defeat of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, an operation begun by President Obama using air power and special forces. He killed Qasem Soleimani in Iraq, the Iranian mastermind terrorist, in 2020 using a drone. He dropped a big bomb on Afghanistan, but then decided overall he didn't like that kind of military presence or engagement, so he helped get us out. And then this term, he's dropped the bombs on Iran's nuclear facilities and watched his friend Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel use air power and special forces to kill key Hezbollah leaders, key Hamas leaders, key Iranian leaders. Obviously, the Israelis had a huge and more difficult and far more controversial operation on the ground in Gaza. But I think what Trump liked was the killing of Nasrallah in Lebanon with this deep penetrating bomb, the killing of the Iranian scientists with this masterful intelligence work, and then limited assassinations and airstrikes. And I think that's where he wants to go as his general model in dealing with Venezuela. So I expect it to be air power, special forces, offshore, blockade, but not the ground invasion. I think that's the range of tools we're talking about.
I mean, that's still a pretty striking development that we would be considering bombing Venezuela and using, special forces or any number of the things that you've just mentioned. So let's begin with what the actual goal is here. Why would Trump want to topple Maduro?
Well, he doesn't like him. Part of it's personal in the sense that Maduro, of course, follows Chavez in Venezuela. They've both been extreme anti-American populists. They both also decimated their country. So he's sort of like Trump's closer by version of Saddam Hussein. People who, these guys, Chavez and Maduro, may not be quite as brutal as Saddam in terms of just shooting people, but they've had many of the same effects on their country of leaving it in ruins. And now Maduro's been doing that for a very long time, in the aftermath of Chavez's death over a decade ago. And then there's the whole Florida thing, Marco Rubio thing, the notion that Venezuela under Maduro has been closed to Cuba, that this is an axis of resistance against American influence within the Western Hemisphere, and that, of course, there are drugs smuggled through Venezuela, even if it's not so much the fentanyl, not so much coming straight to the United States, but still is part of the broader problem of illegal narcotics. I think you put all that together, and you also combine one last piece, which is that Trump has a feeling in his gut, I believe, that he can make big change happen with limited amounts of power. That's a scary thought when you harken back to the days when George W. Bush had the same hope about overthrowing Saddam quickly and easily. War doesn't usually turn out that way, even if you think you have a clever plan to achieve that kind of a result. So I get worried about this notion of committing to push Maduro out with military power. And I still think there's a decent chance Trump will pull back from that ambition. We'll have to see. But, he thinks that he has the toolkit to make this happen. He thinks Maduro's a bad guy, and he's right. He thinks Maduro's a big problem for drug trading, and he's right. He thinks Maduro's a big problem for the Venezuelan people, and he's right. And then there's this additional axis, as I say, with Secretary Rubio, the Florida contingent, and a lot of the special concerns that group has had with the Cuba-Venezuela nexus.
Yeah, I think there's little doubt that Nicolas Maduro has wreaked havoc on his country. We've seen an 80% decline in GDP, matched with millions fleeing the country, killings, torture, political prisoners, everything you can imagine an autocrat doing in a terrible fashion. You drew a parallel to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And of course, in the end, there weren't weapons of mass destruction, but this was largely sold to the American public as a national security issue and a direct threat to the United States. Is there a sense here that Maduro is a direct threat to the United States?
It's interesting. I don't want to make too much of this analogy, but yeah, let's draw it out a little further. I know a lot of the Bush people. I don't know President Bush personally. I never met Vice President Cheney, but I know a lot of the others. And there was a sincerity about what they were trying to do. They were trying to get rid of a really bad dictator. They were trying to send a message that even if Saddam himself was not part of the 9/11 attacks, that the world shouldn't think of us as a paper tiger, and we were capable of doing some big things in reply to that kind of a terrible threat to our own country and people. And by the way, most of us, including myself, thought that Saddam did have chemical and biological weapons. So in that sense, the WMD threat was not invented. It was wrongly believed to exist. Now, the Bush team did some things that I would say pushed the truth too far, including occasionally implying Saddam was thought to have some link to 9/11 and also thinking his nuclear weapons program was more advanced than it really was. But the basic notion of a threat was there. It was just amplified and exaggerated once they decided they wanted to get rid of this guy. So the parallel in that sense is meaningful because Maduro is at least a modest threat to the United States because we have Venezuelan Americans and so forth, because there are drugs that are contributing to the global illegal narcotics economy that do come out of Venezuela, because Venezuela's, neighbor and therefore threat to our good partner Colombia, even if U.S.-Colombia relations are a bit strained these days. So in that sense, there is a threat and Maduro is a problem. The question is, are we now amplifying him as a greater threat than he really is to justify an American military response? And in that sense, there could be a parallel to 2003 with Iraq.
Yeah, which to me brings up the question of, the situation in Venezuela has been a disaster under Maduro for over a decade, including during Trump's first term. So why now? Why this very moment would the Trump administration decide to start amplifying the threat?
Well, since you're giving me a chance to promote my book, let me do it this way by saying it's because Trump's an American, and Americans are restless, and we have been since the founding of the Republic. We like to be in motion. I'm not going to say Trump's like most presidents in personality. And clearly, this is a different kind of president. And by the way, one that I've opposed pretty strongly in my writings and certainly in my campaign donations. And I wish that he were not president. To me, January 6th was invalidating of his fitness for this office. So this is not meant to be a defense of his presidency, but I
And I
see a
should say,
lot.
you're somebody who's served under, presidents of both partisanships, both parties.
Well, on advisory boards. I have
Yeah.
not been a full-time government employee except for the Congress, and I'm very proud to have worked for the People's Branch, because I think executives tend to take too much power of any party and of any personality, as going back to the Iraq War conversation a minute ago. But I think that, in this case, what we see is President Trump even more restless. Some would say neurotic. Some would say always in need of more drama and another, bit of news for the 24-hour news cycle that he's accelerated even beyond CNN and social media's previous accomplishments. And so this is a good target in the sense that Maduro's a bad guy. Venezuela is causing its own people problems. It's causing us problems. And the military options to Trump don't look that dangerous. That may be, however, the premise or the presumption that we go back to 10 years from now and say was the real mistake we made. As usual, thought that the next military operation would be easier than it turned out to be. So I worry about this overconfidence. But I think
Well,
it reflects an American restlessness that's sort of almost in our strategic DNA.
I want to ask you more specifically about some of that overconfidence. You've written about some of the challenges of a campaign that's based entirely on airstrikes. But, just to continue drawing the comparison to the Iraq War, there's some questions about oil and business interests for the United States in Venezuela. And I don't want to sound like, one of those Iraq War truthers at the farmers market in, 2006 or whatever, saying it was all about oil, blah, 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 blah. I don't know if it was all about oil, but the opposition leader of Venezuela is making the explicit appeal to the United States and others saying, hey, if you oust Maduro and I'm in power, I am going to work with you to make sure that we can capitalize on Venezuela's oil reserves. So, in some sense, that carrot is already being waved towards, American politicians' interests, what have you. I mean, how much of this is, oh, there are some opportunities here for business?
Well, as Ms. Machado pointed out, there is potential opportunity, and I have no problem making that part of the calculus. I'm not against Venezuela and the United States both doing well economically by collaborating in a future government, but I would never begin an argument about war and peace on those kinds of economic grounds because, again, that presupposes a clean victory, a rapid change, and rapid improvement in the economic partnership. And, again, there's nothing against wishing for prosperity that would help the Venezuelan people as well as the global economy. But I just worry about a lot of scenarios that could drive Maduro from power and not replace him with anything stable enough to actually allow this transformation in economic relations to occur. So rather than deny that there are economic incentives, rather than accuse people of having economic incentives, I would just want to cast a pragmatic and sobering argument that it usually doesn't turn out as well as you hope. The Iraq War, in my judgment, was not fundamentally about oil. But if it had been, we did a really bad job. We didn't wind up getting that many contracts for American firms. We spent a couple $1 trillion of taxpayer money on the effort. We lost 4,500 American lives. We left Iraq's oil economy not much better than it had been for at least a couple of decades. So usually if we elevate economic incentives, again, I'm not saying we did in Iraq, but if you were to view that as a major reason for overthrowing Saddam, it didn't play out very well on economic grounds. And I'd be wary of making that a prominent argument here.
If we are going to pursue airstrikes or we're already pursuing a blockade, regime change, what have you, would Congress need to vote on that?
I think Congress should vote on that and should be asked to vote on that by the Trump White House. Although, in this sense, Trump would also be continuing a tradition of post-World War II American presidents in often not asking for authorization. And by the way, I'm a Democrat, but let me say Democrats have often been the main problem on this because President Truman did not ask Congress for authorization for the Korean War. President Johnson barely asked Congress for permission for Vietnam. He just asked for permission to enforce a maritime safety zone around the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964 when there had been some exchanges of fire there between the U.S. and North Vietnamese ships. And that was the only authorizing debate or legislation we ever had on the Vietnam War. And I think since Vietnam, we've gotten a little better. And both President Bushes did go to Congress to ask for support for the Desert Storm operation of 91, the overthrow of the Taliban in 2001, the overthrow of Saddam in 2003. You could say Congress made a mistake in approving the latter in particular, but at least there was an effort not to declare war, but to have a full-throated, open congressional debate and vote on the subject. And I think when you're talking about overthrowing a leader, starting a conflict in a new place, that is appropriate. There are lots of debates about just where the line is over a limited use of force and something requiring congressional authorization. But I think when you talk about targeting a regime with the potential, therefore, to require follow-on operations to help stabilize the country as the previous regime falls, that's exactly the kind of situation where Congress can and should be involved.
I'm mostly going to ask you this question so that I can ask the follow-up question of what the worst case scenario is, but what's the best case scenario for a use of force in Venezuela?
That's a nice framing. I like that. Well, the best case, I suppose, is that Maduro voluntarily steps down, having secured a place to have asylum, maybe in Russia, maybe in some other country. I don't really know the candidates. Most countries don't really like this guy too well. I guess he could go to Cuba, maybe Nicaragua. I don't know. But if he were to step down and then ask his military leadership to collaborate in the establishment of Ms. Machado as president, or at least a caretaker government, whether overseen by the United Nations or the Organization of American States, leading up after a couple of years, maybe 2 to 5 years, to an election. I don't believe in rapid elections in this kind of situation, by the way, because they become naked pursuits for zero-sum power. And so that often produces more chaos and violence than you expect. But that kind of a scenario would be the best case, where Maduro decides, you know, his time has come. Trump is committed to overthrowing him one way or another. Better to get out early, take an asylum, rather than wind up like Saddam Hussein did. And then we have Maduro trying to facilitate the gradual rebuilding of Venezuelan institutions under new leadership. That process would be ugly, but it might be peaceful under the scenario that I'm positing.
So I don't know if we had any public opinion polling of Iraqis in the lead up to the Iraq War, but there is public opinion polling conducted in Venezuela. And so I'm just going to cite some of it so we get a sense of what the people on the ground are thinking. A recent study by the Andres Bello Catholic University found nearly 8 out of 10 Venezuelans felt a change in government was necessary. In a poll conducted by the Caracas-based firm Data Analysis last month, 23% of Venezuelans said they supported a foreign military intervention. Some 55% opposed it. 70% said they had a negative impression of the country's circumstances. Actually, the negative impression of the country's circumstances is somewhat similar to how Americans feel right now. But you can also see a majority there saying that they don't want foreign military intervention. Also, interestingly enough, as we find in the United States, this political security concern didn't actually rank number one when it came to Venezuelans' top concerns, but rather the economy, poor salaries, and inflation were the number one concern. So even when there's a national security concern like this, the economy still ranks number one. So a lot of similarities in politics across countries. Okay, so now I've established how Venezuelans feel generally. What's the worst case scenario for this kind of pursuit?
Well, the worst case scenario is probably a little different